The pastoral letter that Bishop Thomas referred to, the deacon icon of Jesus Christ the servant, can be found at this website, and you can just print it right off. Diocese of Marquette, Diocese of Marquette, MARQUETTE.org. Dioceseofmarquette.org. If you go to that website, you can find the publication and just print it right off there. Monsignor Singler. Oh, I'm sorry. One last thing. Monsignor, there's another bathroom. We don't have to use just this one here, but if you go right, then make a left, and then just to the right as you get to the end of the hallway, there's another bathroom on that side if you need it. Thank you.
And you can stop at the BP in Bowling Green if you need to do that too. I was telling the bishop that I could drive down 75 blindfolded now because all of the places along the way are the bathrooms that I need to stop at on the way to an event. And yes. Those of you who have had the distinct pleasure of having me as one of your liturgical formators may recall a parting comment that I made to all of you. More of a mantra, not intended as a threat, but more as a promise that I conveyed to you as the day of your diaconal ordination approached, that I would haunt you if you did not follow the things that you were taught. Do you remember that? I'm back. Actually, like Bishop Thomas, I would like to affirm you and express my gratitude for all that you undertake in the service of God's faithful ones. It has always been a privilege, my privilege, to have your acquaintance over the years, and I know that many sacrifices have been made by you for your pastoral care and service of others. And as a priest of the diocese, I am most grateful for that. Our purpose today at this point in our conference is to reiterate some of the fundamental principles that underlie the liturgical role of the deacon during the sacred liturgy. Of course, much of the more practical aspects will focus on the deacon at Mass, and particularly the role of the deacon at pontifical liturgies when assisting the bishop when he presides. So much of what I'm going to say is nothing new to you. You've heard me say it over in formation or in other gatherings when we have been together for the deacon assembly, and I've been asked to speak on liturgical topics and the like, so it will not be anything new. I would like to think that it's just a matter of my guidance along the way. I'm kind of like the billboard, reminding you along that pathway of what we taught you in formation and bringing it once again before you for your consideration. And why is that? I think sometimes we become creatures of habit, and I know that one of the aspects that hopefully we'll have in our Q&A is maybe a pastoral approach when our pastor tells us one thing, but the diocese has told us another. You know, a preference of how things are supposed to be done. And we hopefully will talk about that in the Q&A. But what I would like just to reiterate are the sources that are accessible to all of you, just to review them once again. The general instruction of the Roman Missal. You can find that document printed in the front pages of the current publications of the Missal. There are other separate publications. You can go online to the online publishing services of the United States Conference of Bishops just to get the actual pamphlet version of it, if you will, of the general instruction of the Roman Missal. That is certainly one of what I would call a primary source. Whenever you happen to be on ceremonies with the diocesan bishop, locally in the parish or at a diocesan liturgy at Rosary Cathedral, the Ceremonial of Bishops would be another document that would be certainly accessible to you, either in its published book form, or I'm sure you can get it online. I have no doubts about that. So access to that to kind of refresh your mind as far as how we hope to provide for the role of the deacon when assisting the bishop when he is presiding. And from time to time, we do issue from the bishop's office or from the Office of Divine Worship Diocesan Guidelines, various things that come up. We recently have revised the confirmation, the planning booklet for confirmation in the local parishes and in the diocese. And we hopefully, during the break, will have that accessible. I know that some of you have picked them up already. We do have some published printed materials for you today that we'll be using during Dan Dembski's segment in his presentation. But those guidelines are kind of what I would say the fresh publication that will help you to have the most current type of guidelines that have been developed. And again, much of it is due to the fact that we have a new bishop, and the bishop is the primary liturgist, the chief liturgist of the diocese, and there may be specific preferences that he, in virtue of his office as the chief shepherd and liturgist of the diocese, can change things where the church allows that to occur. Now, there's some things that a bishop can't change because the church, has authorized that, but he is the one who is the person who's to safeguard the norms and the guidelines that the church intends in its authority. And so there are places and circumstances where the diocesan bishop is permitted to provide some direction in his authority as the chief shepherd and liturgist of the diocese to bring about certain practices and norms in the diocese. So our first attempt would be, within the last 7 months, are these guidelines for the celebration of confirmation. And again, those of you that have had the opportunity to serve as an assisting deacon to the bishop and the local parish or at the cathedral, we certainly want you to be aware that those guidelines exist, and we want you to be familiar with them. And then, of course, the other aspect of a source to be consulted, the bishop mentioned it earlier in his presentation, are the rubrics. Read the black and do the red. And I want to just really kind of underscore, if at all possible, a principle that you all heard me, those of you that had the opportunity to have me in formation, always consult the rubrics, because it will tell you if there's an option provided in these or similar words. Okay? If that rubrical note is not present in the ritual as it goes along, the assumption is that you're going to say what is in print in black in the text. Only when the church permits it and offers that rubrical note is the option available to provide some kind of pastoral circumstance or situation in warranting how we word certain things. Which leads me to the kind of the first liturgical principle that I want to review with you that you all have heard me say over and over again is a Latin maxim, and the bishop made reference to it: lex orandi, lex credendi. The law of prayer is the law of belief, and we can even do that vice versa. The law of belief is what is the law of prayer. In other words, what we say in those ritual texts is what the church believes, and vice versa. I think that we have to keep underscoring that. But I think sometimes we, in our settings, our pastoral settings, it might be in the local parish or in a particular circumstance, might have the idea that, well, I'm gonna bring this down to a much closer level to people, because the language, at least in our personal judgment, doesn't touch their hearts. And yet, the church has challenged us to pray and has authorized us to pray these specific texts. And there's several dynamics that are at play in all of this. I think one of the key aspects is that when we begin to take liberties with ritual texts, we end up not doing what the church wants us to say. It might be our best intention. We really want to be a servant leader. We want to touch the minds and the hearts and calling people closer into the prayer. But when we take the liberties to do something just the opposite, we say, "Oh, I'm gonna do my own penitential rite. I've got a better way of expressing this." And the intent then is that really it isn't what the church intends in what we've said. So my point in underscoring that principle is not to tinker with the rites of the church. And what was another thing that I told all of you in formation years ago was you can't go wrong with the right. You can't go wrong with the right, R-I-T-E. Okay? That is a key principle and aspect that I think that is really important. So adding lib, winging it, so to speak, thinking that we have something better to say than what the church intends for us to say, I would hope that you would see that the authority the church gives you, the delegation that the church gives you in virtue of ordination as an extension of the bishop's public ministry as a servant in charity to the people of God, that we would be all on the same page. By the way, what I'm saying to all of you today, I would say to my brother priests. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. Okay? Again, it's a matter of changing the culture. One of the things that I think that since the Second Vatican Council and the time element that we've had these number of years since the reform of the liturgy took place in the 60s, and then we went through the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, is that we've just kind of relaxed our attitude about everything. Everything just kind of, just do whatever you want. If we have the similar formatting, we follow the order, but we can kind of do our own thing, that somehow is going to be reflective of the mind of the church. And again, I think that makes an ecclesial statement that we've separated ourselves from the unity of the church. That we've built this community itself apart from the church community, the unity of the diocese, the unity of the church in the United States, the universality of the church around the world. So that aspect is so very vital. The purpose of the revised third edition of the Missale Romanum was to provide a more literal and an accurate translation of the Latin text so that the expression of the church's mind and heart would be unified. And again, I'm not going to go in through the history of the various translations since the council of the sacramentary of the Missale Romanum that we've had. And again, because when we came to the point of the new missal translation, we explained all of that. We gave that history and that background of how that came to be. But the point is that the new translation, the third edition translation, is one which was a much more literal translation to the Latin. And why was that so important? Why can't we just use pedestrian language or street language, you might say, in offering the prayer? Well, because that's not necessarily what the church intends us to say. There's something deeper spiritually that is being conveyed in those prayer formularies and the like. And again, when we begin to take liberties ourselves to say, I'm just going to do my own thing, I don't like it, I don't like that prevenient word, whatever word, consubstantial, I'll just skip over it and not do it. We're really shortchanging the people of God. And by the way, if we want to talk about rights, the people of God have a right to the rights of the church. And when we begin to withhold that as the church intends, in my estimation, and you can correct me, Bishop, I think it's a violation. That's a true violation of what the church intends them as members of the body by way of their membership in the church. So we have an obligation to that. With all good intentions, I suspect that many ministers desire to add their own perspective in a language that we might think people need to hear, but the church intends us to hear something different. I would suggest that we need to read through the ritual text and know them so well that only when the rites say and print in these and similar words, only then are our own words to be used. Too often, I think our desire to be relevant with our language, as I said, creates a separation from the unity of the church. And then our ecclesiology becomes compartmentalized. I think the best rule of thumb is to use the formularies authorized by the church, and there are options available. I think I'm speaking from the perspective of my brother priest, some of them. Some of them I don't think have actually taken the Roman Missal and looked at it by way of paging through to see the gift that it is to us, to know that there are options to the penitential act. There are formularies already prepared in the appendix in the back of the book. Or to know that for a funeral liturgy, for instance, that there are optional orations geared to specific circumstances for one who committed suicide, or a death of a child before baptism, or a tragic death, or one who died of old age. There are the church in its way has provided those formularies, those ritual formularies, for those kinds of circumstances. But again, it's a matter of knowing what's available to us when we're in a circumstance like that. And I use the funeral rite because some of you do wake services in the funeral home in parish, in your local community. And to know that those kinds of things exist, well, to do that, you have to look at the text and to know what's available. And sometimes that means you have to reread. I find myself going back to the Roman Missal all the time, to find out what's there. I still, after several years now of using it, I still don't know what's all in it. I mean, I have to go back and page through and look and read and acquaint myself with that. Even to go back and read the general instruction of the Roman Missal. Now, you might find that challenging. The diocesan person in charge of liturgy doesn't know that by the back of his hand. I go back to it because I want to make sure that I'm conveying the correct information. But to be able to do that, we have to go back to the source, and we have to read the ritual text. Another principle that I would like to say to you is that language is formative. And I don't know if we oftentimes think of it, we just think of it as a matter of just doing it. I have to say, I mentioned this to the bishop after our morning prayer today, I could tell that, and it might be the fact that in most of our settings, we do the private recitation of the divine office, but I really wanted to slow all of you down today. When we did the psalmody, we really rushed through that. And if you notice, I made a deliberate effort in between all of those psalms to pause. Because as soon as I did that antiphon, and you did it right, the side was with me, we got right into it, we did it. And I always ask myself the question, do we take the opportunity to digest the things that we're saying, that we're speaking, rather than just going through the rote pattern of getting through it? And I suppose when you're praying the office by yourself, you may be pressured by activity that's going on or an event that's coming up or whatever. I have the privilege of praying with the bishop during the week in our residence. And I know that one of the things that was a learning curve for me upon his arrival was the way in which he took his time. And I remember telling you that. We took our time in praying morning prayer together. And it makes all the difference in the world because you actually begin to digest when you're hearing the words being spoken. So language, what we say and how we say it, is formative. Okay? Just as gestures and body language and vesture for the sacred liturgy is formative as well. The care with which we go about our ministry, how we attend to it, whether we're rushed or we're fastidious in the sanctuary. And I know that some of you have been on with me when I have had the privilege as the bishop's delegate to do confirmation, where you've assisted me and I've just simply said, slow down a little bit. You can slow down, take your time. We'll get there. We just need, but that says something to the people who are participating, what it is we're doing. This is a sacred act that we're celebrating. This is not just, going to a dinner party and moving about and getting through it. But again, we are conditioned by our culture. In our culture, all we're concerned about is getting through and getting it done and moving on to the next thing. I think that's the challenge, and how the liturgy can transform the world is how we approach it. The gestures by way of assisting the bishop, as an example, with regard to the use of the incense incensing at the beginning and how we do that, and knowing what the church is asking us to do when we do the gesture of incensation at the celebration of the liturgy. That would be another way, that's another visual way of how people see us in that role, and it forms them to know, what is really essential and important. One story of a deacon who will go unnamed. I don't even know if he's here today, but I'll just say any deacon might have done this or whatever. But how we minister or prepare ourselves for the celebration of the liturgy, for instance. A deacon who has the book of the Gospels at his side, here like this, and he's walking out of the sacristy, getting ready for the entrance procession. That to me says this is just kind of like any normal book. I'm going to the library with my study book here. That says something to the people who are witnessing that. So how we approach the ministry from the very outset, from the moment we are vested in that sacristy, and even how we undertake our ministry publicly, whether it be at the liturgy or not, is formative to people, and we have to keep attending to that. Another aspect that I hear more from priests, particularly some of our senior priests, where they'll say, well, you liturgists, have all these new things, these newfangled ideas going on, and so now you're telling us that you're going to change this and this and this and this. And the reply back from them always has been, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. And I'm just going to do it the way I want to. I've been doing it this way forever and ever, and I just intend to do that. Well, I beg to differ. First of all, we are not dogs. We are human beings. And what we do in this life of ours on earth as human beings is we learn to adapt, and we can change when we need to change. When an individual finds out that he has high blood pressure and the doctor says, you're going to have to go on blood pressure medication, we learn to do that. We adapt to that. We might go stomping our feet doing it, but we eventually learn to do that if we want to sustain our life. We sometimes have to change our pattern of doing things. We do that. We're capable of doing that in life. The same thing is applicable when we're being asked and charged to change, our ways. I think one of the examples I always like to fall back on is what happened as a result of the publication of the third edition of the Roman Missal. I know some of my brothers who, and I've talked to them about it, just have not, they'll do their own thing for the orations. They retranslate on their own. I know of one of our pastors who is no longer with us in this life, who used to go through and take a pen and just cross out all the words in the old sacramentary because he didn't like the words that we're using, and then wrote his own texts above in the orations. And again, to me, that's a violation of what the church intends her members to hear and to pray. So again, I think we learn to adapt. We're capable of doing that. It just means that we have to think about it, pray about it, and make every attempt to find ourselves attuned to that. The other thing that I think would be a principle for me is, and a challenge, is that we take time to practice the rites. You all did it at the time when you were being ordained to the diaconate. But sometimes we need to revisit those things and find ourselves, maybe having a mentor to walk through the ritual to make sure that we're calling ourselves to accountability on that. I was very touched by the bishop's story of the deacon who asked, would you help me get through this, and how touched he was by the bishop's taking time to walk through the rite, through the Roman Missal, and things that, nobody ever took the time to do that. 419-244-6711, extension 322. Dan Dempsey would make himself available. We have other priests in the diocese and other deacons who might be able to be that mentor if there seems to be something wanting, or maybe just a sense of accountability about what we do. We're never above the service that we provide in the church. We always have to revisit that. And that is what brings the vitality and the service of the church all the more present to our people. Finally, and this is not so much in principle as much as an introduction of a new perspective, an angle that we are now going to be taking in our diocese. We've been dialoguing the Office of Divine Worship with the bishop for some time since his arrival about this, about how we view the diaconal role when you are assisting the bishop for a pontifical at the cathedral, or let's say you're in the local parish and you have a number of deacons there. Our current practice in the diocese is to have 3 deacons on for a ceremony, and we have referred to them as the assisting deacons. We might say even this, and then breaking that down, the speaking deacons, the spoken parts, which would be the introductory rite to the preparation of the gifts, and then from the preparation of the gifts to the conclusion of the Mass. And that would be broken up by 2 individuals who are assisting at the altar. And then there was the gospel deacon who carried in the book of the Gospels in the procession and then proclaimed the gospel. We did that with the intent of having, it's got called the school model, of having everybody do something, some active activity. Taking our lead from the ceremonial of bishops for a pontifical mass of the diocesan bishop, there will now be 2 deacon chaplains sitting on either side of the bishop, and there will be the deacon of the mass who will do all the speaking parts, the penitential rite, the proclamation of the gospel, the universal prayer, the spoken parts of the liturgy of the Eucharist, and the dismissal. So there is only one deacon who's at the altar with the bishop, who does all the speaking parts. The 2 deacons sitting on either side of the bishop will serve in the capacity of chaplains, that is, to provide a ceremonial integrity to the role undertaken by the bishop, who is the chief shepherd and the high priest in the diocese. They manifest the diaconal role of the bishop as a visual presence, even though they're not going to say anything. They're there as chaplains. It could be that there could be a need for something to occur for that given liturgy. The bishop drops something or needs something taken care of. Those 2 chaplains are there to serve in that kind of a capacity. Their role is to remain in the bishop's chair throughout the Mass. They kneel there and not speak any particular parts. And they would be among those deacons called upon to distribute the precious blood during the Mass. Does that make sense, what we're attempting to move to? It's a cultural thing. We have been doing it a certain way for a certain amount of time, and now this kind of is going to be a different way of looking at it. I think it's a much more sensible way of looking at it, and certainly a much more spiritual and theological way of looking at the role of the deacon when we're celebrating the liturgy. I'd like to just maybe ask, anything that I just said at this point, does that prompt any kind of question in your mind or perspective or whatever? Yes. Okay.
Would the speaking deacon then also prepare the gifts, the chalice?
He does it all.
He does it all.
Yep.
Okay, good enough. Okay, they clarify that.
And again, it's not a matter about having everybody do something. Your doing is being there, present in a way of one of the orders that is manifested by the bishop himself. Have you ever noticed when he presides for pontifical masses, the majority of them, particularly ordinations, the bishop actually is wearing a dalmatic underneath his chasuble? Did you know that? Some of you? How many didn't know that? It's okay. And why is that? Because the bishop manifests the fullness of those orders of priesthood and the diaconal role. So ritually, and in the vesture, he wears a very lightweight dalmatic underneath the imaginable, but he is the sign of the fullness of those three orders of bishop, priest, and deacon. Bishop, you wanted to have a couple.
Thanks.
Okay.
Just a couple of things, and I'd be glad to have Monsignor come back and take any questions. But just starting on that last point, and I hope you understand, when anybody new, and you know this, if you go into business and you're brand new, you go in with a fresh set of eyes, right? So oftentimes you're seeing things that other people perhaps haven't seen before. And you know the old adage, when the person with the fresh set of eyes says, well, why are we doing this? And everybody around them says, well, that's the way we've always done it. So when I asked, well, tell me about the role of the deacon. So I had the explanation. And again, please know, everything I say is not a trashing criticism of all that has gone before me. If you think that, you're wrong. It's a fresh set of eyes that simply wants to do what the church asks and to do it beautifully for the sake of the liturgy. So I asked, tell me about these deacons. So the response was, well, Bishop, we've got the speaking deacon, and we've got the gospel deacon, and we've got the altar deacon. And I stopped and I looked and I said, so the deacon who does the gospel, there's no speaking role? And they sort of looked at me. And I said, isn't he speaking something? Well, yes. I said, well, then why do you call it the speaking deacon? Well, that's what we've done. I'm not trashing that. But what we're saying now is to try to make the integrity of the role of deacon, and also to be frank with all of you, wouldn't it just make it easier? Because in most of your parishes, that's what you do. You're the deacon of the Mass, right? And that we also have to say, and I don't know that Monsignor mentioned, that pretty much across the board in the world, this is where they're moving, to a deacon of the Mass. And therefore, he is the deacon of the Mass, and the chaplains are chaplains. So that's just a note. Second note is please recognize that you're going to say, why is the bishop reaching this way? Or why didn't this happen? Or why did he do that? And the simple answer to that is, your new bishop is left-handed. So you have to understand, I am totally right-brained. And I am absolute in my left-handedness. So if I reach out to take the boat for incense, to be able to put incense in, it's not because I disrespect, devalue, or hate the deacon. It's because maybe the stupid boat doesn't open very wide for me to get the spoon in because of the poor way that it's made, right? Or maybe it's that because you're standing here, I may not be able to get to it as easily with my left hand as someone who is right-handed might. So I ask you to pause and stop and think, maybe there's a really simple practical reason why that's happening. So what I'm doing has nothing to do with disrespecting a deacon and everything to do with, as highly as we can, respecting the sacred liturgy. The next note I want to say also is, you'll notice some practical changes. So many of you were present for the Chrism Mass, right? And I can tell you, after this year's Chrism Mass, I had priests, deacons, consecrated religious, seminarians, and lay people say to me, wow, Bishop, that was unbelievable. Oh my, that breathing over the oil, I don't know what that was all about. Gosh, this all changed. Where did you come up with that? Did you make that up? I didn't make anything up. It's in the ritual. So it may have been in the past, it just wasn't visible to some people, simply where the bishop did that ritual behind the altar. And I understand that in the past, there were already sealed oil bottles filled in wicker baskets that were placed out front. And I chose, for the richness and the dignity of the liturgy, to do it in a different way. And I can't tell you the comments that I've received, Monsignor has received, of people saying, that was extraordinary. When we heard you breathe on the oil, it was unbelievable. Everybody was able to see everything because it was out front. So again, I'm not trashing or devaluing the past. I'm trying, as I've said, Dan and Monsignor know well, my line is, I'm just trying to take a 98 to 100. And that's what I'm all about. Lastly, a principle before we break again, and this is the classic threefold principle. Are you ready? Here's the clear reality, and this is the surefire way for confusion and disaster. And that is, if you put one of three things or people near the sanctuary, surefire rule for liturgical confusion and disaster. So if you put a dead body, a couple, or a bishop anywhere near the sanctuary, nobody knows what to do. Dan and Monsignor, oh, what do I do? Oh my God, what am I going to do? The servers, it's Mass. So remember the classic principle. If you put a deacon or the people together and you've got a dead body, a bishop or a couple, isn't it true? Some people say nobody has a clue what to do. So there's no need to be all nervous and excited and fragile and frantic if you know what you're doing. And you know your bishop expects you to know what you're doing. And if I forget something, I expect you to help me. You know, in your role as deacons, the role of deacon was the original master of ceremonies, right? That's who the bishop depended on. There was no master of ceremonies. It was the deacon who served as the master of ceremonies and assisted the priest. So one time, I was so frazzled with what was going on, a dog had walked up the aisle. I forgot the creed as priest. And afterwards I said to the deacon, why didn't you tell me? Because he knew it. Oh, well, I didn't want to embarrass you. I said, embarrass me. I said, I'm not above the liturgy. So all of us need to be helped. But remember the principle, a body, a bishop, or a couple, and nobody knows what to do. Monsignor, do you have something else?
Any other observations of anything that was just said in this segment? I didn't want to just rush off into a break, but we're to that point already, believe it or not, to have another break. And then Dan is going to kind of focus more on the nuts and bolts of some of the things that we have encountered in the practice of working with you in the parishes and in the diocese. And I think what we'll do, is it on the back table? Maybe during this break, if you would not mind to get, I think there's 3 items, Dan. There is a I call it the Deacon's cheat sheet, of all the parts that the deacon would do, and this is the 3rd time we've issued them to you. I know because we're the ones that took care of making sure that we got them out to you. And also the confirmation preparation guide for confirmation, and then also the excerpts or the actual text of the general instruction, the Roman Missal, the segment specific when a deacon is assisting at Mass. So you want to pick those 3 up out in the vestibule before we return here. Okay? We'll take a 10-minute break. Thank you.